We have a job to do. We have a job to do. We are the ones who have the knowledge. And because we have the knowledge, we are the ones who have the job to do. And that job is to work on the specific things that any of our organizations believe are priorities. Whether it's the reestablishment of wild sheep places, or whether it's working with agricultural interest. Think about things like pheasant and other species that rely on those lands. But we also have a job to do to convince the broad public of America that this business matters. And it matters so much that even our politicians might want to pay attention and make it some kind of priority. Because currently in this country, as in Canada, it is not a priority. We came through a period in the late 1880s and the early part of the 20th century where if the powerful piece of legislation that you have discussed over the last couple of days in relation to sage-grouse, had it been in existence, white-tailed deer, pronghorn antelope, mule deer, Canada geese, wood duck, black bear, and a host of other species, elk, wild turkey, would all have been listed. There's no question. They would all have been listed. And yet, a system of institutions, policies, and laws, and funding mechanisms, ideas were generated in America that enabled us to not only recover those populations, but to build an economy of enormous size around their enjoyment and use, to bring prosperity to rural communities that they would not otherwise have, and opportunities, to build jobs in this country, to protect land, to protect the quality of ecosystems, and therefore to safeguard the benefits that apply to all citizens. Wildlife is a democratic resource. It is held in the public trust, yes, and that's important to recognize. But more importantly, it is ours. It is something to inspire us. It is something to give us a sense of joy. It is something to empower our imaginations, to drive our art, to drive our narratives, to give us a sense of a greater world that is capable of giving us unique things that we cannot find in the world that we construct. It is not some sideshow. And it is not a simple process. And so when we come together in this partnership, in this alliance that carries the name of the great man who gave us such inspiration and ideas, and we see the challenges that we have before us, for those of you who may not know the history that well or are trying to learn about conservation, please understand that when this movement was started, these were the challenges that were faced. There were no federal institutions. There were no state agencies. There were no effective enforcement mechanisms. There were no university programs teaching the knowledge of how to manage wildlife and ecosystems. There were no funding mechanisms. None of the policies and institutions that we take for granted today even existed. Yet, people just like you came together and said, we will not lose this resource. And they started the long, hard, difficult road of building these institutions to make them work. Why? Just so they could benefit? Many of them worked on issues that would never see realization until they were dead, like building an ancient church. Many of them did things for the great ideal that it would matter to future generations and to their nation. And the reason that we still have these policies and laws and institutions, and the reason that you are here now, and the reason we have the abundant wildlife that we do, is because we never, in all that time period, in all that long arc, we never let them slip through our fingers. And we continue to build them, to make them better, to pass new legislation, to bring new ideas forward, to establish new organizations, and to motivate new generations who would take up the torch, who would bear the responsibility to make sure that we kept wildlife with us. So as we grapple with problems, whether it is the public lands issue, or whether it is the potential listing of sage-grouse, or any of the other big challenges of climate change and others, the loss of habitat, the great species extinction that the world is seeing, we have to recognize that in those challenges and in those crises, this is the opportunity yet again for the American mind that seems to be so drawn and capable of dealing with crisis to rise again to these equations, these circumstances, and to create solutions. In the case now before you of this ponderous, penetrating legislation of such scope and weight, the Endangered Species Act, here we now see before us the possibility that finally we may, so long after its passing, exercise it in such a way that it actually lives up to what the intent was, to give wildlife a hand up, to make sure species did not get on the list, not to take great joy in building a great list of endangered species. It amazes me how little the citizenry of our countries, Canada, the United States, and Newfoundland, know about all this. Walk into a store, talk to a truck driver, talk to somebody in the service industry, talk to a lawyer, talk to a religious leader, talk to a banker, talk to a construction worker, and ask them, do you know why we have wildlife with us today? Do you know that elk that you saw by the side of the road? Do you know why he lives and he is here? Do you know why those streams are still full and you can throw a fly across them and bring a living, bright creature out of that realm into the air? Do you know why the great predators, the snow dog, the big wolf, and the grizzly bear still live in our midst? And the answer is the vast majority of our citizens don't know at all why this is true. So we have a lot of media here, and you are and must be our allies in this. We have to communicate this story. We have to make the publics of our nations understand that it is by virtue of effort, by virtue of commitment, by virtue of ideas, by virtue of saying we will never let the wild others go, that we will keep them with us. There is no shortcut, no easy route. It takes money. Of course it takes money. But you know what it also takes? It takes, first of all, ideas, passion, idealism. These are the currencies that ultimately drive the greatest conservation system the world has ever seen. It was born in this country of the United States of America. And in my view, it represents one of the true acts of American genius. The national parks, the wildlife refuges, the national forests, all the things that we have given the great wilderness areas, all of these things that we have placed in trust so that all American citizens can have access. Future generations yet unborn will still have the opportunity to see and to wander in these mountains and to see wildlife, only by virtue of what we do. Every step we make, it is the collective power of those individual steps that have led us here. And we cannot ever falter, not for a single moment. We cannot let one good institution go. We cannot let one good piece of legislation weaken. We have to strive to continue to make this system better. Why? Why? Why should we strive to make this system better? Because a mountain without sheep and goats on those craggy peaks is just a pile of stone. Because a forest without wildlife and singing birds is just a big dark space of vertical things. Because a river does not have the flash of black backs and silver sides that scurry away from it. It's simply a pile of water flowing somewhere. And because if we take these things from us, if we lose them, we lose something that is absolutely irreplaceable. We can replace a building, we can replace a vehicle, we can even replace art, but we cannot replace these wild creatures that made us who we are. And many in this room have taken their lives willfully. Many of us in this room hunt and fish. They are sentient creatures that we kill. They feel the bullet exactly the same as any person in this room. There is no nice way of getting around this, no metaphorical language to change the truth. And so every single one of us in that group, and that includes the millions others of us, bear a responsibility to wildlife in our countries that is orders of magnitude greater than any citizen who has not done so. And if we could mobilize by our groups just the 35 to 40 million people in Canada and the United States who every single year fish and hunt, pursue these wild others in those activities, we would launch a movement that will be absolutely unstoppable. But we need to do more. We need to turn this movement, this exercise that you're all involved in, this attempt to deal with specific issues of lands, private and public, and of endangered species, whatever the issues, energy development, to take those issues and make them part of a broad social discussion. They matter, for God's sakes. They matter to the economy and livelihoods of people, to the status of nations. Any nation that cannot protect its natural resources, what do they have to give their citizens? What other gift will they offer up in transfer that will equal it? How much is the sight of a bugling elk in an alpine meadow in a fall morning worth? Less than a Picasso? Or 10 times more? this organization, carries the name of the man who was once President of the United States of America, and remains one of the best known and most admired of all the presidents of this country, which has come to be the most powerful and influential nation on earth. And he was very much at the beginning of that arc of ascendancy for this nation. He wanted it to be so. He was determined that it would be so. But along that way, that man of such vitality and brains and energy and courage, characteristics that are symbolic of any great man or individual, along the way, he came to love wildlife. And before people get the impression that Teddy Roosevelt was the big gunslinger, always out there ready to shoot something down, he was a man who knew the songbirds of this country intimately. He was a man who could recognize them by their songs. He was as good as any birder in the nation. And the people who knew him said the two things he cared most about in his life were his family and birds. An illustration to every hunter in this nation and every hunter-based organization that to only wrap our arms around those animals that we pursue is a fatal flaw. He taught us, he taught this nation that one could not call oneself a citizen of this country if one did not care for the natural resources of the country. And everybody talks about the statistics associated with Teddy Roosevelt. How many refuges he established, how many acres of land he set aside, how many national forests, the great images of him in the last hours of his time as president, scratching out these great big, polygons on maps and saying, now there's that forest and there's that forest and all of that. All of it's true. But I have a question for the members of this audience. I want every single person to answer this question. Why, when Roosevelt did so many unpopular things, locking up resources as some people saw it in these silly refuges, fighting to establish national parks, busting up the great monopolies and the wealthy cartels that existed in this nation, why, when he did so many things, closed down the markets for wildlife and put all kinds of people out of business, all kinds of industries, all kinds of wealthy giants, slammed them to their knees? Why, as soon as he was out of office, did they not reverse these decisions? That is the question anyone involved in American conservation has to answer. And why, not only immediately after he left, why in this long arc of time, with all the Democratic and all the Republican office holders who have been there since that time, never really have these policies, laws, and institutions been torn apart. Was that because we're still expecting Teddy to come out of the wall? Or does it seem possible that those ideas became embedded quietly, meaningfully, inside the heart and soul and psyche of Americans? They don't necessarily wear it on their sleeves, but what about somebody proposed eliminating all the national parks in your country? Do we think that would be a popular move? Who would be so absolutely insane to even suggest it? We have the potential to raise that feeling in the American citizen to a higher level. We have the capacity, because of these historical facts, the opportunity to raise conservation to what it must be, which is a social movement. It is not a niche movement. It is not just for hunters. It is not just for anglers or those who are against hunting or against angling. It is for every single citizen to play a role in. Then our government institutions will make the decisions that will be in the best interest of those wild others. These debates about public lands, and these debates about the role of the private landowner that harken all the way back to Leopold and long before him. These ideas about how to deal with the listing of sage-grouse. Finally, there is an iconic issue that we can suddenly see as a mountainous thing that we have to deal with. These are opportunities to build coalitions that have not been forged before. And we will only keep those wild others with us by building those coalitions. The days of government being able to do this, the days of government being able to fund this, the days of our funding mechanisms as they exist to be able to continue to make this happen are behind us. They are already behind us. And we have to find in these challenges and in these crises the opportunities to build these new initiatives, to take and transform old institutions and to build completely new ones, to do the job of conservation. And I believe this country will. I have enormous faith in this country. And I have a lot of reasons for having enormous faith in this country. And I believe every American citizen has a lot of great reasons to have faith in this country. So I believe that we stand on the edge of a new era in conservation. And in partnership with Canada, we have the chance to bring this North American approach to a higher level. And we have a chance to convince people that those wild others, they really do matter. And they matter in so many ways. For those of you who write, who speak, who are part of the media machine, please consider that this is not just a small issue. We currently have in the two countries, and if we add the third, we have a few more people. We have somewhere between 35 and 40 million people who every year harvest from our lands and waters an amount of wild food that is absolutely mind-boggling. All over the world, nations are concerned about food and how we are going to provide the 7.2 billion on its way to 8 and then on its way to 9 with sufficient resources from this planet to live a quality existence. We have never, in all of our tremendous history of challenge and success and effort, we have never yet attempted to quantify just how much value there is in the wildlife that is actually harvested by these 35 to 40 million people every year. I just want to tell you, while I have you together, that we are now going to do this. In partnership with organizations like the Wild Sheep Foundation, Dallas Safari Club, U.S. Sportsmen's Alliance, a wide variety of others, we are now going to measure the entire amount of wild protein that is harvested by the 35 to 40 million people on this continent. We are going to give it a monetary value, working with economists to say how much that meat is actually worth. We are talking hundreds of millions of tons. We are going to work with nutritionists to say how valuable that is to the nutritional economy of our countries. And then we're going to ask how many people benefit from that. Do the rough calculation. You kill a moose, you kill an elk, you share it, let's say, with 4 people. If there's 35 to 40 million of us sharing with 4 people, we're touching 160 million people out of the 330 million people that live in our countries. In fact, it is more. This wildlife resource that we fought to bring back, that currently is feeding that number of people. And then we're going to ask, well, what would happen if this stopped tomorrow? What if we did not have that, or could not harvest that? What would be the cost to our society of the loss of wildlife habitat, of the energy consumption, of the use of chemicals, of pesticides, of herbicides? What would it cost to replace that massive amount of food that now comes to everyone as a benefit of the efforts that were made over the last 100 years? Wildlife is not an insignificant resource. If tomorrow somebody said we are taking a piece of agricultural land out of existence to put a hockey rink there, people would say, that's absolute madness. You can't do it. But show them a piece of land on which wildlife thrives, and they say, well, as long as there aren't any minerals or gas or oil, I guess you can have it. Because there's no valuation put on wildlife. Well, it is worth something. And it's worth an incredible amount of clean, organic food in societies now that are preoccupied with clean, organic food. And we can harvest more, way more, than we're already harvesting. Why do I remark this? Because I want you to all know about it. But I remark it also because I sat down today thinking about this after a discussion with the Elk Foundation and after a marathon session with Randy. Don't ever agree to be on his podcast. Run. As soon as he mentions it, just run. This possibility of measuring this food, let alone us having it, would never have been possible except for the fact that 100 years ago and more, people just like us said no against impossible odds, said that we would not lose these treasures. And when we meet like this, we are involved in the most important work that it is possible to be involved with. If we cannot save these lands, and we cannot save these species, I am prepared to argue with anyone that we cannot save ourselves. We will die spiritually first. We will no longer see them, whether to pursue in the hunt or just to look at. But then we will start to die physically, because if that land cannot support them, and all of the services that they give in the ecological fabric of life, the land will not support us either. Go to nations in the world where their wildlife has been lost and look at the circumstances in which the people live. Go to places where wildlife remains, is husbanded and stewarded, and you will see a different world. I encourage this organization to please understand that there are many people, many people, who really believe that what you do is really, truly important to them. By virtue of the great efforts of United Airlines I spent an unexpected night in Chicago on my way to work and met with some of the most astounding examples of indifference on the part of the service industry that I've ever encountered. The next morning, going from my hotel, I went to get my flight to Bozeman. And I make it a habit when I travel, I always get my boots shined in airports. I don't care if I can see my face in them. I always get my boots shined. Why? It's like getting in a cab in London, England. You learn more in that taxi ride than you learn for the next 2 years from talking with that person who's up there driving. Well, it's the same way with the individuals who shine shoes. So I'm always talking to them, and I have all kinds of friends now in Toronto Airport and various places. You know, they wave to me as I go by, and talk to me, and some of them are Iranian, some of them are Pakistani, some of them are East Indian, some of them are Mexican. And in Chicago on Monday morning, an elderly black man was there. He was just setting up his booth, and I said, well, here's my chance. So I went up and I popped up on the seat. You always feel like a kid, you know, in a high chair anyway, when you get up there, you know, to position your feet in so you don't fall off and all this kind of thing. So anyway, he starts talking to me as he's spraying my boots and shining them. And he said, you know, I always wanted to be a conservationist. I didn't tell him anything. We had no conversation about anything. I always wanted to be a conservationist, he said. And what I really wanted to work on were those apex predators. This was a man, I would say, close to 70 years of age. I asked him, I said, well, how long have you been shining shoes? He said, this is my 37th year doing this. And I said, you never went into that field? He said, no. We let that drop because there were probably obvious reasons why he couldn't or didn't have the opportunity to do that. But then I told him that's what I did. And his eyes became as big as saucers. And he started to talk. He started to talk about the drive that he took through various states, the animals that he saw, how he used to go fishing, bluegills and other things, and he was telling me all about this and how they'd fry them up and how good they were. And in between he'd look at all the pretty women walking down the aisles, you know? And then he'd go back to the conversation again. It was absolutely marvelous. And of course I probably should thank United Airlines, because without them I wouldn't have had the conversation. My point is, just because the public does not stand up and say it is the most important thing, that doesn't mean that we don't have the raw material in the public to work from. I guarantee you there's a man who shines shoes at Chicago Airport who's an ally of this organization. Never forget it, because in the end, he will make the decision for all of us.